You're listening to the Turn Autism Around podcast, episode number 139. Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Hank Schlinger Jr., who is a BCBAD. He received his PhD in psychology at Western Michigan University under the supervision of the late Dr. Jack Michael. He is currently an ABA specialization option and BCABA course sequence coordinator in the Department of Psychology at California State University in Los Angeles. We are talking all about Hank's brand new book, How to Build Good Behavior and Self-Esteem in Children. I only read the first few chapters and I already love it. We talk all about 5 problems that parents face with parenting any child of any age with or without a disability. We talk about myths regarding positive reinforcement. We talk about bribery, all kinds of things that are critical that both parents and professionals know. So let's get to this important interview with Dr. Hank Schlinger. Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. I am so looking forward to this. So why don't we start with describe your fall into the autism world?
Well, my fall into the autism world is an interesting story. We have to go back more years than I would like to remember. And I was an undergraduate student at North Texas State University outside of Dallas in Denton, Texas. I was in my 5th year of being an undergraduate student, which tells you, that I wasn't doing too well. My direction was not too great. I was living in a duplex, and one day a girl moved into next to the other side of the duplex. She had moved up from Dallas, Texas, and she had moved up to take classes with someone by the name of Don Whaley. And at that time, my hair was down to my shoulders, and I was playing guitar, which I still do, I was pretty much a recluse. And so, I met her, obviously, and she said, and it was summertime, and she said to me, well, I'm going to take this summer class with this professor, Don Whaley, and why don't you take it too? It's be a really cool class. And I said, and she was an attractive woman, so I said, okay, I'll do it. I'll do what you asked me to do. It turns out the class was 7:30 in the morning, 5 days a week in the summer. And I was a musician, so that obviously did not jive well with my schedule. The first day of class, in walks this person who was a pretty large. He was a big man, had a long beard, but he was even bigger in his personality. And he said to us, well, we have a very short summer session, and I'll give you an option. You can either write a 40-page term paper, or you can work with an autistic child in my center a couple of days a week or something like that. And I had no idea what autism was back then. In fact, back then, and again, I'm not specifying what year it was, almost nobody had any idea what autism was. But I thought anything would be better than writing a 40-page paper. And so a day or two later, I showed up at the center. It was a center-based program in concert with the university. I showed up, and within a day or two, I was sitting in front of a real live child. And now back then there was no ASD, so all of the kids who were diagnosed with autism were all classic autism. They were all the most severe cases of autism, nonverbal, self-injurious, highly stereotyped behaviors, lots of echolalia, no self-help skills, just really the most severe. And even then, those parents had difficulty getting their kids diagnosed with autism. And within a few days, I was still being trained, but within a few days, I was working with kids with autism. Sitting across from these kids who, to my mind, they were the most bizarre kids I've ever seen. I'd never seen people behave that way. I'd never seen nonverbal kids. I'd never seen kids with echolalia. But that was a very powerful moment for me. It was powerful in the sense that not only as an undergraduate was I now given the opportunity to work one-on-one with a child who needed help, but I got to see pretty immediate effects of my behavior with these kids. And I can't think of anything more powerful than that. To be able to see that not down the road years or months, but immediately changes in their behavior as a result of what a very weakly trained undergraduate student was able to accomplish with them.
Yeah.
So
And that is, I always ask the same question when I start interviews. And if it's a parent, they fell into the autism world with their child. And then sometimes it's, in Bridget Taylor's case, it was a sibling had, I believe, Down syndrome, not autism. And sometimes it's a sibling. But most of the professionals that come, it is a similar situation where they respond to an ad or they start working with a kid with autism. And I like what you said. It was kind of just immediate. You changed, they told you what to do and you did it, and then the behaviors changed. And it's really powerful when you see that happen. So did you go on to then get a master's and a doctorate and in ABA?
Well, I worked, at that point in time, I had not really decided on a major. So at that point in time, I made my decision to finish a psychology major. And before I finished, so I'd worked there for, I can't remember, at least a year. And before I finished, a friend of mine and I, he already had a master's degree. He was at North Texas State University. It's now called University of North Texas. I was from Dallas, and that's about 30 miles south of Denton. I decided to transfer from North Texas State University to Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And I met with a faculty member there, and I proposed to him that we open up or start a center-based program at SMU like the one I was trained at North Texas. And he thought it was a great idea. I only had a bachelor's degree at the time. I mean, I didn't even finish my bachelor's, so I went to SMU to finish it. He agreed to be the clinical director, and so we opened up sort of a satellite program at Southern Methodist University, which was similar to the program at North Texas State. The programs were center-based, and they were very unique because what they did was each semester they recruited undergraduate students, usually psychology students from the university. And so they were trained on site in the center at the university by people like me. At that point, I had progressed to be someone who could supervise. And so we trained students every semester. So students would come in. We had a constant flow of workers, of people who could work with the kids. And we would come in every semester. They would get course credit. We would train them. Some of them stayed for more than a semester. And so I ended up doing that for three or 4 years.
Yeah. And that still is happening, right? Because you at many places they do have Western Michigan, which you were trained there, right?
Yes.
Under Dr. Jack Michael, who has passed away about a year or two ago.
Yeah, last November.
And so they do have, Western Michigan has an affiliated center where undergrads go and get trained. And I mean, it's not like every university, but a lot of universities. So if you're listening and you're a parent in, somewhere in the United States, you should check where there's potentially universities who have an ABA or psychology sequence and see if there is an autism clinic. It doesn't necessarily even have to, I mean, it would be best if it was ABA, but it doesn't have to be. Some of them are more like directed by the speech department and multidisciplinary students. But anyway, so I want to get to your new book. And you wrote actually 4 books. And when I was looking at your new book, which is called How to Build Good Behavior and Self-Esteem in Children, and this just came out in 2021. And then you also have 3 other books, and including this one, which I had on my bookshelf, which is published way back when, in the 1990s. I got it in 2005. It's called A Behavior Analytic View of Child Development. Yes. But, from your background, you were trained very scientifically. And
Yes.
I'm only partially through the book, through your new book, How to Build Good Behavior. And I'm very impressed. I'm really loving it. And one of the things I'm really impressed about is how you were able to take your scientific background and really try to put it in a very layman's term for parents and for professionals trying to help parents. So why did you decide to make that shift and to really try your hand at real parent information?
Well, for years I've taught courses on developmental psychology, and as I taught those courses as a behavior analyst, I found myself having to translate traditional developmental terms and concepts into behavioral ones. And that's kind of what led me to write the book that you held up, The Behavior Analytic View of Child Development. But in some of those courses, I had students do behavior change projects, and many of the students were either parents or they had younger siblings. Some of them were autistic. Most of them were typically developing, and so they would do behavior change projects, and they all did the very interesting projects, and they would come in, and they weren't trained at all. I mean, I talked to them how to do it in class, and I would we would talk in class about what they should do and stuff, and many of them came back with really almost miraculous results of just changing fairly simple behaviors in their kids, or if they were teachers and their students. And so I accumulated those over a number of years. I also wrote a column for a local newspaper called Behavioral Health, and I wrote mostly about kids, about behavior problems in kids. And I've done some parent consulting. So all of those kinds of things kind of accumulated, and I just felt it was the right time to write a book. And then I had my own kid about 11 years ago, and so that might have been the impetus for doing that.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I think it's great, and it brings all the scientific background you need, but really presents in very easy to understand language. So chapter 1, which is literally page 2, you identified 5 problems right out of the gate, which I loved. 5 problems that everybody faces, no matter if your child, what age they are, if they have any diagnoses. It's just right out of the gate. So number 1, parents fly on automatic pilot and are not aware of how their behavior affects their children's behavior and how their children's behavior affects theirs. So can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. Well, before I do that, I just want to point out that the scientific principles of behavior analysis, ABA, they are applicable to any behaving organism, right? They're not just applicable to a certain age group or a certain gender or whatever. They're applicable across the spectrum. And by spectrum, I'm not talking about the autism. I'm just talking the spectrum of living beings. They're especially, I think, useful in human behavior. So it really doesn't, from my perspective and from the perspective of the science, it doesn't matter whether your child is 3 years old or 10 years old or diagnosed with autism or diagnosed with ADHD or not diagnosed with anything, or behaving really badly or behaving kind of badly or behaving well. These principles can be used to improve their behavior and their self-esteem. So I wanted to kind of get that
right. And that is important. And I know our regular listeners know all that, because
yes.
I've been touting that forever. And I also will put that in the show notes. I have a solo podcast show that I did on ABA and the 5 myths of ABA and how ABA is a science, and it's operating all the time, whether or not you believe in it, whether you like it. It's kind of like gravity. You reinforce a behavior, it's going to make you go up. So that is good to point out. So, and that's one of the things in the first couple of pages of your book that is like, this doesn't matter. This isn't, well, that's not for me, or that won't work with my child. These are general principles. So parents basically are flying on autopilot. They're not being taught what to do that
Well,
in
you
college?
know, yeah, we're all flying on automatic pilot when we interact with people. And we do that until or unless there's some problem. And then we ask ourselves, okay, there's a problem here. And at that point, that's when parents of kids have to be aware of how their behavior affects their kids' behavior. Because there's an expression, and I mentioned this in the book as well. The expression is the kid is always right. And what that expression means, well, what it doesn't mean is that the kid always does what you want or the kid always does the right behavior. But what it means is that whatever the kid does because there's a cause of the behavior. And from the perspective of behavior analysis, the causes don't come from within the kid. They come from in the kid's environment. And that can include parents or siblings or other relatives or teachers or friends. And so if you're a parent of a child, I think one of the most important first steps that you can make is to try and become aware of not only what does your kid do and when do they do it, but how do you react to it? What do you then do? Because we do all fly on automatic pilot. I've been doing this for many years. When my kid was born 11 years ago, and I'm an older father. When my kid was born 11 years ago, I had already been really well trained, by working with kids with autism for 4 or 5 years, and then training graduate students to do that. And so I was aware of much of his behavior, but not all of it. I can't be aware of all of it. It's too much work. But the more you can be aware of what your kids are doing at the moment they're doing it and how you react to it, that's really the first step to being able to change their behavior, to being more productive, better behavior for the kids and for you. So that's why the automatic pilot section there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the second problem you identify is parents think that just telling their kids how to behave will work.
Oh yeah, this is a common problem that you see everywhere. A kid misbehaves and a parent says, don't do that. Or the parent sits the kid down and says, now, it's not really nice for you to behave that way, because how would you feel if other people behave that way? And sometimes parents do this with like 2 or 3-year-old kids who have no clue what the parents are saying, right? The parents are rationalizing and reasoning with them, and they're like, their language abilities are not, at a level. And we all know how that works. It doesn't even work with adults. If you tell adults, go exercise or stop eating those fatty foods or please say thank you or call me when you get home. Telling people to do things rarely gets them to do it. So that's that's again something that parents do when they fly on automatic pilot. That's what their parents did with them. That's what they see. Maybe maybe they read that somewhere. And so they tell their kids. And then a few times in the book, I asked the Dr. Phil question. I never really watched Dr. Phil, but I know the question that he asked. And I think it's a really good question. And the question is, how's that working for you? And so if you find yourself telling your kids what to do and you find them not doing it much of the time or any of the time, the question, how's that working for you? That means that's probably not working. There's probably something else that you should probably think about doing.
Right. And some kids, like I'm thinking of some previous clients and kids in my book, Turn Autism Around. And I'm thinking of Max, and he was a second born child, and he had a sister 2 or 3 years older than him. And everything was fine with the little girl. She was calm and everything was fine, but Max had some neurologic differences. And so he cried a lot as an infant, and he, sand bothered him and he would tantrum. And so what worked for the sister didn't work for Max. And they were kind of on autopilot doing the same things that they did with the little girl for the little boy. And it wasn't working. It was just getting worse. And also the second problem with just telling kids is I did a video blog on why teaching kids with autism with serious language impairments, I'm sorry, can actually make things a lot worse. Talking about problem behavior after the fact and viewing it. It's like, if that was for attention, that's going to shape it up if they can understand what you're saying. And that can get really shaped up. But but I think a lot of these things are covered in all 5 problems together. So let's just get through them. So problem number 3 is parents teach their children to be the boss. What do you mean by that?
Well, one of the things I've noticed over the last many years is that parents, many parents, not all parents, many parents indulge their kids, or they're afraid of their kids, or they don't want to upset their kids. They want them to be their friend or something like that. And so by doing that, they let the kids dictate what happens. I give an example in my book, which is a really trivial example, but I think it makes the point. My wife and I took our son to, I think it was kindergarten one day, and a mother had brought her daughter who was in my son's class, and then she had a younger daughter who was like 2 or 3, I can't remember, and she had put her shoes on backwards, so she had her left shoe on the right foot and her right shoe on the left foot. Not a big deal. And another mother said, "Oh, your daughter's shoes are on." Well, I told her that they were on the wrong feet, but she insisted that she wanted to wear them. And so there you go. So she had the shoes on the wrong feet. Now that example is not a serious example unless she wears her shoes on the wrong feet all the time. I don't know, but it points out a problem, which is, when a parent says she insisted, I'm like, wait a minute, who's the boss? She's 3 years old. You're the adult. And I've of course witnessed many other examples of this. So so parents allow their kids by giving in and not being firm, and you don't have to be mean, just be firm. And of course an example like that will evolve and accumulate and snowball to more serious examples where kids insist on things.
He won't let me hold his hand. It's like, right. No, that's a safety issue. He won't. Right.
That's right.
He won't walk up the steps for bed and fall asleep in his own bed. He insists on sleeping on the sofa.
That's
falling
right.
asleep on the sofa, watching TV. It's like,
yes. Yeah, there are a million examples.
And we'll talk about this, but yes, the same thing is true for a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or 12-year-old. However, if you have a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old who's as big as you are, then, it's not a matter of just being firm, because now we've got more issues. But let's get through our 5 problems and we can talk about that.
Sure.
Number 4, parents ignore good behavior and teach bad behavior.
This is probably the biggest problem, if I could single out one. And that is, and this isn't just true of parents, it's true of all of us. As long as people are behaving the way we want, we don't really feel the need to let them know. So it's like, your daughter is in the other room and she's playing quietly. I'm so thankful she's playing quietly. I hope it lasts, for a long time or whatever. Instead of going in and saying, sweetheart, you're playing so quietly by yourself. That's such a big girl, being able to play by yourself and whatever. But then let something break or drop, or let her hit her younger sibling and somebody cries, the parent's on it like Johnny on the spot. And so instead of going to the kid whenever they're behaving the way you want them to behave, what we do is we just are glad that they're behaving well, and we don't say anything. And you see this in public too. Parents take their kids out in public. The kid's walking quietly and nicely by the parent in the grocery store, and the parent, the parent's busy. They got a list. They got to find food or whatever, but they're not interacting with their kid while the kid's being good. But boy, let the kid knock something off a shelf or start whining or crying, then the parent turns to them. And of course, that attention often ends up being positive reinforcement, and the kids now have a start a behavioral problem. So that to me is the biggest issue. So, and let me say one more thing. When I talk to parents, and I really only have like a few minutes to talk to a parent who has a problem, the one thing that I tell them is try to identify and be aware of when your kids are doing what you want them to do, and make sure you pay attention to it, or praise them, or interact with them. And when they're doing the things that you don't want them to do, if you can, try not to interact with them and not pay attention. If I can give any advice in just a nutshell to parents, that's the advice.
Yeah. And in both of my books and all of my stuff, I really go with Glenn Latham's 8 positives to every negative, really try to be mindful of that. And when you do get a negative, you have to give a negative like a reprimand or, affirm, no, we're going to do this. Then you got to clear the slate and you got to go back to your 8 positives. And it's like that's not just for kids or kids with autism.
Oh, right.
Across the board, in our interactions, we want to be positive. We want to be in positive, relaxed, a stress-free environment as possible, and not
that,
oiling the squeaky wheel.
Right. And that leads to, as I say in the title of the book, that leads to self-esteem, because when kids are behaving well, they feel better about themselves. And that's pretty much what we mean by self-esteem. And they're happier with themselves. And then the parents are happier with the kids. And then, everyone lives happily ever after.
Yeah. Okay. I like that. And number 5 is parents think that the kid they get is just the luck of the draw. Sometimes you get a good kid and sometimes not such a good kid.
Yeah. We don't really, you mentioned the two siblings a few minutes ago.
Max.
And we don't really know specifically what kinds of neurology our kids have. There are no neurological diagnostic tests for anything, for ADHD, ODD, autism, any of those things. We infer neurological deficits or problems based on severity of behavior. Let me give you just an example. Before our kid was born, we had a cat, and our cat was a really well-behaved cat. He was trained well. He was nice. He was affectionate. People would come over and they'd say, "You're so lucky. You got a cat who's well-behaved," and we would just sort of write that off. Then we had a kid, and our kid ended up being really well-behaved and talented and all those things. And people would come over and say, "You guys are so lucky." And so then I wanted to say, how many well-behaved creatures do we have to have in our house before people are willing to acknowledge it's not the luck of the genetic draw, it's the environment. And so if I can just talk about the example that you gave of the little boy who cried and tantrumed, there may be some neurological reason why those things started, but as soon as those behaviors occur, then they affect the environment and how the parents react to those behaviors. And this is why it's important, as you said, to really get to parents when they have very young children, because right out of the gate, you can start positively reinforcing behaviors you want and not reinforcing behaviors you don't want, even if those behaviors are the result of some genetic or neurological issue. They become much more exaggerated and worse by how people react to them. And I think that's a really important lesson for parents of any kid, to start really young, when they're very young.
Yeah. And Max, for instance, the family moved to my area and I became his early intervention provider when he was 2.5, maybe.
Yeah.
He had just gone to a developmental pediatrician, a hospital-based clinic to evaluate him a month before they moved to my area. And he, for an hour and a half, just screamed during the evaluation.
Yep.
Mom was in the room. They were trying reinforcement. He just screamed bloody murder. And so he was actually, they said they couldn't diagnose him or rule anything in or out because he just screamed. Right. And so then I started working with him, and I was like, I can't tell if he has autism. He's so temperamental. And then within each, he had neurologic differences. You also have the kid's personality. I have 2 sons, Spencer and Lucas, and Lucas has moderate severe autism. Spencer, who's on episode number 85 of my podcast, we can link that in the show notes. He's in medical school, very bright and talented. And, but Spencer all along had, he was much more sensitive, more high maintenance. His personality, he was well behaved, but So some, within each child, you don't get a good kid or a bad kid, but you
Right.
do get kids with neurological differences, with personalities that tend to be more stubborn, more sensitive to things, more, and so each child is different, but
Yeah.
not to say that. And just because Lucas has moderate to severe autism doesn't mean, this is one of my pet peeves and my soapboxes, doesn't mean that I should expect a lifelong of aggression and self-injurious
Right.
behavior
Right.
and tantrums and flopping on the ground.
Because those behaviors aren't caused by autism. Those
Right.
those are and when I first started working with kids with autism, we had to spend so much time breaking through all of the learned bad behaviors that parents inadvertently, I mean, they didn't know what they were doing, because and also because there was at a time when autism wasn't even widely known, and they did the best they could, but they inadvertently reinforced a lot of bad behaviors. So we had to break through the tantrums and the flopping on the ground and all that stuff before we could actually begin to deal with the deficits caused by autism.
Right.
And so another reason why your emphasis on dealing with toddlers and very young kids, as soon as possible, is really crucial, because the longer you wait, the more of these kinds of troublesome behaviors will appear, and then those are the ones you have to work with, like the kid screaming for an hour and a half, before you can even get to the point where you can determine, if there's anything wrong with the kid.
And Max actually had a very good outcome. I took videos. I did the screening tool for autism in toddlers, took the videos, sent them into the developmental pediatrician. 4 months later, we went to visit. I went along with Mom and Max to visit for an evaluation. She had just watched the videos that I had sent to her 4 months previously. And she came in and he was really doing much, much better. He was pointing, he was showing, he did have a tantrum or two, but it wasn't nonstop tantrums. And she actually said, I came in fully expecting to give Max a diagnosis of autism, and I don't see it now.
Yeah.
And
That's amazing. That's an amazing story.
yeah. And it can happen. And so some people say, what do you mean by turn autism around? And an action guide for parents of children with early signs of autism. Like, you can't prevent or turn autism completely around. It's like, maybe it wasn't autism to begin with.
Right.
Number one. Now we're talking the age of COVID isolation for our toddlers that we're talking about. So maybe it's looking like autism and it's not. Or maybe we can prevent and turn it around. And you know what? It's just good parenting and engagement. So it doesn't hurt to try.
That's exactly right. That's the main point. Yes.
Right. And even Dr. Ami Klin, who I did a solo show about his important work in episode 93, he said he doesn't believe, he's an autism researcher for decades, and he doesn't believe you can prevent autism or turn autism completely around, but he does believe that you can prevent and turn speech disorders, behavioral disorders, and intellectual disability, with often coincide with autism that's not treated well. You can reverse all that. So it doesn't matter. We're just trying to help the child reach their fullest potential.
Right.
So, and teach the parents how to avoid the 5 problems that we just identified.
Yeah, and parents want to feel like they're in control. They don't want to feel like things are out of control, and so really, and I think the bottom line about all this is that it's the principles of behavior analysis that can turn those things around.
Yep.
That can prevent a lot of troublesome behavior, and possibly turn autism around depending upon the kid, and and all that stuff. So regardless of what it is, it's these principles that we're talking about that are really, and I have to say, I've been doing this for a long time. My mother, who's quite elderly right now, she keeps telling me, she says, I cannot believe that you are still as passionate about this as you have been for the last 30 years. She says, that really is a testimony to something about what you're doing. And my answer to her is, it's a testimony to the field and to the science, because it generates optimism if you can really put the principles to work. It's saved a lot of people, a lot of families, a lot of heartache, and so that's
Yeah, no,
that's why I'm still doing this.
Yep. And there's a lot of us that are still very passionate because we know it works, and we've seen not good things not work, and it just breaks your heart when you see a little 2-year-old not getting the right treatment, not the parents not getting the right advice. And some of the parents that are getting early intervention services, for instance, they might have 1 hour of a speech therapist, 1 hour an OT, 1 hour of a teacher. They're all coming in. They're all very well-meaning, very seasoned professionals in their field. And we've had, multiple speech therapists, OTs, a PT on the show. And we're not dissing anybody, but they are not experts in ABA and the science that you outline in this really great book. Okay, you also talk a little bit in the book about discipline and how discipline, which I did a video blog on, is means to teach.
Yes.
And so when people think of discipline, they think of punishment. And a lot of non-ABA folks also think of ABA and they think of punishment. Why is that?
Well, I'm not sure I know the answer to that completely. It may be, a lot of misinformation or disinformation. It also may be that punishment, the way that we define it, and so I guess we need to do that. Punishment is not something you do for revenge or to get even with somebody or to hurt somebody. In behavior analysis terms, the principle of punishment is simply a consequence of behavior that reduces the frequency of that behavior. It's not, so we don't punish kids, we punish behavior, right? And that's a huge philosophical difference, thinking about, I'm going to punish my kid. Well, there's like anger involved in that, and there's, revenge, but I want to punish that behavior, which means I want to decrease that behavior. I like the other behaviors, but I just want to get rid of that behavior. So the fact that we talk about punishment, and I do in the book, I don't think it's avoidable, because even the natural environment punishes behavior. If you're careless while you're cooking and you accidentally pick up a hot pan, you won't do that again. The pan punishes the response of being careless. If you're careless while you're cutting some vegetables and you cut your finger, that will punish that behavior. You won't do that again. If you are careless where you're walking and you walk into a chair or a door, you probably won't do that again. So punishment is a part of the natural environment. But I think what we in behavior analysis do is we emphasize positive reinforcement most of the time. There may be some times when punishment of a behavior is necessary or called for. But even then, the kind of punishment strategies that we encourage are not physical punishment. We don't encourage hitting or screaming. The kinds of strategies we encourage are more things like response cost or timeout or things like that are more, natural kinds of punishment strategies. So I think the fact that we talk about it at all might lead some people to think that, but I don't see it as avoidable, because there are times, maybe rare times, when you actually need to reduce behavior and through some punishment strategy. So.
Right. And we do, I think, talking about positive reinforcement a little bit more is good. And punishment is a part of the science of ABA, like the natural punishments. And I personally believe that like timeout is one of the most overused, incorrect procedures that in the whole world.
It's because it's used incorrectly.
Yeah, it's used incorrectly. It's overused. It's not. It's used by well-meaning parents and professionals, and that's another reason to start super young. Is you're just going to really try to shape things, try to be super positive, and use extinction, which is things like planned ignoring, where you're not actively punishing. You're just like, okay, we're the spoiling grandma, everything's good. We're telling Johnny yes, and good job and nice playing. And then something screaming happens and we're not responding. We're just not going to keep the reinforcement going.
Right.
And
And
so,
I have a whole section in the book on planned ignoring
okay, good.
and
I didn't
how to
get to
use
that
that.
yet. Yeah.
But you know, but you know, it's that has to be used in conjunction with positive reinforcement for alternative behaviors. So for
Yeah.
the behaviors you want, and this gets back to the problem of paying attention to positively reinforcing the behaviors you want in your kids,
Right.
and not paying attention to or reinforcing the behaviors you don't want. And
Right. Okay, so in Appendix 2, 5 myths regarding positive reinforcement, we really covered this pretty well. I think myth 1, reinforcement doesn't work with humans. We pretty much said like the science works. We are humans, we are animals. It works with animals, it works with humans, it works with kids with disabilities, kids without,
yes,
adults. Myth number 2, using positive reinforcement is bribery.
yeah, yeah, that's a pretty common one. The definition of bribery is giving somebody something to do something bad. You give them something before they do it, like here's $10, go do this. But positive reinforcement is giving somebody something after they do behavior to get them to do the behavior again. And I have to say, you can positively reinforce good behavior or bad behavior. As I talk to my students, I tell them reinforcement is an equal opportunity consequence. It will strengthen or increase good behavior, and it will strengthen or increase bad behavior. The point of the book is to become aware of the good behaviors that you want and make sure that you intentionally reinforce those and don't reinforce the bad behaviors that you see. So yes, it's definitely not bribery. That's just by definition it's wrong.
I talk about bribery in my Turn Autism Around book, and I have a graphic there too. And I kind of say, if the child is doing the right behaviors, and we're in charge of the reinforcement, and we might even offer a promise reinforcement, like first we're going to go to the haircut, and then you're going to come home and you're going to get X, Y, and Z. Right. That's reinforcement. That's adult led, and it's proactive and preventative. And then bribery is when the child's already whining, crying, screaming, flopping, and now you're offering a bribe to straighten up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the kid in the candy aisle flopping, and then you're like, and I realized that scientifically it might involve negative reinforcement or positive punishment and all other things, but I think just in general layman's terms, that threatening and bribery all happen kind of in the middle of proper behavior.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So myth number 3, using positive reinforcement is unnatural.
Well, that's obviously not true, as all of our behavior is reinforced all of the time. I tell my students, I sit here at my desk, if it's a little dark, I reach over and I flip the switch on my lamp and the light comes on. My behavior of pushing the switch in the lamp has been positively reinforced because the light comes on, and I will be more likely to do that again. And so it's no more unnatural than, as you mentioned earlier, gravity is unnatural, or the laws of thermodynamics or anything else are unnatural. Now, what people might mean by that is it might be unnatural to intentionally use it. But the question that I would pose is, would you rather use it inadvertently or unintentionally and teach your kid bad behaviors, or would you rather use it consciously and intentionally to try and increase good behavior, to build good behavior? And I think that's the choice that you make. I hope people choose the latter.
One of my former clients, Cody, who's featured in the book, and his mom was on the podcast in the past, I remember I had a student come over to observe me with Cody, me working with Cody, and her supervisor or something came over to the house. And they said afterwards, they were watching me working with him, mostly at the table and delivering reinforcement. And they were shocked by how dense the reinforcement was.
Yeah.
And, that's where people are like, oh, well, we don't use edibles and we don't use screens and we're not, it's like, well, how are you going to change behavior?
Right.
Like
Well,
praise or stickers are probably not going to do it to,
right.
do it for a young child without language. In order to get the language, we're really going to have to use
Right.
powerful
Yeah.
reinforcers.
And the whole point of doing that is to thin them out and to gradually fade them away so that the more natural reinforcers, which are there, constantly in our environment, take over. And once they do, then people don't really notice the reinforcement because it's automatic, it's subtle, so you don't really notice how. Yeah, it's natural. So yes, I think that maybe instead of a natural, people might have a problem with it being contrived, but you only contrive it when you want to build good behavior. And then once you do, then other natural reinforcers take over and you don't have to keep doing that as much anymore.
Right. Which is myth number 4, using positive reinforcement is manipulative. I don't think we really need to,
Right.
We just kind of covered that. And then myth number 5 is using positive reinforcement undermines intrinsic motivation.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
that's a really constant criticism by a small group of people. It seems like it's a bigger group than it really is, but it's a small group of very vocal people who make that criticism. It's based on really flawed research, and I don't really think we need to deal too much with that because
Right.
if we go back to what we just said, which is if you start off with contrived reinforcement for behavior, and then you fade it out gradually, then the kid's doing it because the kid likes it and because the kid wants to do it. Well, there's your intrinsic motivation.
Right. Like Lucas is 25 now, and we took him to a program to learn how to ride a bike 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And then we let the bike sit, and he hasn't ridden it for over 5 years. So we got the bike fixed, and like going out for the first time, I had to have a big promise reinforcer. I mean, he was really nervous.
Yeah.
So like first we're going to go out and mommy's going to help, and and somebody else is going to be on a bike, and it was a little touch and go. I'm like, oh boy, I don't know how this is going to go. And we set out with the promise reinforcer, what would happen after the bike. And now, his therapist took him out on the bike the other day by herself with no prompting needed. He was able to get on, and he had a smile on his face. So it became like, that is a reinforcer now. And that's where we're constantly pairing and making neutral things positive.
Yes.
But whenever you're talking about a hard task or adding a hard task, like, so he's been going to the barbershop for years, but then we decided, you know what, it would be better if because he doesn't tolerate the spray very well. It would be better if he used the sink and she could really shampoo his head. So to add that task, we decided, okay, we're going to add the task and we're going to add a positive reinforcer. Now he goes and it's part of the routine.
Yeah, that's
so I think hopefully those are good kind of applicable suggestions for people. So when they think about reinforcement, it's planned, and it's, and sometimes it can't be edibles. The child's on a tube feed, or it can't be screens. The family is no screen family. Perfect.
Well, there's no
reinforcers.
Yeah, in one of the chapters I talk about different kinds of reinforcers, and there are 2 kinds that are free and easy and abundant. And the first one is attention and praise, and the second one is the Premack principle, which is and we've used this with our son since before he could walk. And essentially what that means is that you look at what the kid's doing, and whatever the kid's doing is the stuff the kid prefers to do, right? Kids and adults, whatever we do where we don't have to work, that's the stuff we prefer. And so I try to identify what he wants to do at the moment. And if there's something we want him to do, then we simply say, okay, that you can do what you're doing now, but first we want you to practice your piano, or first we want you to, do your homework, or first we want you to clean your room. But then you have to make sure you follow through, because a lot of parents teach their kids to debate and negotiate and argue by saying, well, I'll do it. I won't do it now. Like my son will say things like, I promise I'll do it. I'm like, no, you don't. You won't promise. You have to do it now. Or let me just finish this. I'll do it in a few minutes. And parents go, okay, right, as long as you do it. But then guess what happens? They don't do it. So if you tell your kid, okay, I want you to clean your room, pick up your toys, then you can go play on your iPad or whatever, then you follow through and make sure that they only get the iPad if they do what you ask them to do. And if you're consistent doing that, then things will go smoothly for you, you know.
Yeah.
Your kids are really smart at finding the soft part, the soft underbelly, right? They're really good at finding the loopholes, the weak spots, really good. And we teach them to be really good at doing that. And it's really difficult to be consistent so that we don't allow them to do that.
Okay, well, I know there's a ton more in the book. I definitely would recommend it. How to Build Good Behavior and Self-Esteem in Children by Dr. Henry or Hank Schlinger. And you can get this at Amazon or wherever you buy books. Is that true?
It's on Amazon.com, yes.
Okay. And then your website is buildgoodbehavior.com. That's where we can look for your other books and your work. And it's all very exciting. And I really, this is our first meeting and first of many, hopefully in the future. Yes. I think we're definitely in alignment on so many issues. And so it's been a real pleasure to get to know you better. So before we wrap up and let you get out of here, part of my podcast goals are for parents and professionals to be less stressed and lead happier lives. So what is your advice, stress management tips, or self-care tools?
Well, the title of the book is How to Build Good Behavior and Self-Esteem in Children. And throughout the book, I talk about if you use positive reinforcement to build the good behavior that you want, not only will your kids have more self-esteem, but they will be happier and more relaxed. And if your kids are happier and more relaxed and doing the things that you really want them to do and not doing the things that you don't want them to do, not arguing, debating, screaming, tantruming, crying, then that's the best stress management I can think of for parents with kids.
I think that's very good advice. And I know as a mom to a son with autism and a son without autism, that is all true. And yes. I thank God every day that I did become a behavior analyst and I have the power to change behavior in my sons and, former clients, online participants in the world, because the science is very powerful and you remain a passionate advocate. And I thank you for your time today. Hopefully our listeners have enjoyed it. I know I have. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mary. If they do go to the website, they can contact me through the website, or they can sign up for updates or whatever. So and they can also get the book from the website. And I want to thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast. I'm a little disappointed that I'm number 139 or something.
139.
Yeah, I would prefer to have been a little earlier, but that's okay. I'm happy to. I'm at least before 140. So I'm happy.
Yep. So it's and I would love to have you on again in the future. So we'll keep in touch. Please let me know. Or all the show notes that we mentioned, all the resources will be at marybarbera.com/139. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
If you're a parent or professional and have benefited from the information you learned from me on this podcast, or from my Turn Autism Around book, or from my online courses, I would love to hear about your success. Please go to marybarbera.com/success and fill out a very short survey. On the survey, you can upload your book or podcast review, or you can share a picture or a video and tell me how your life has been impacted. I will personally review everything submitted, and I would love to hear from you. I'm on a mission to turn autism around for millions of children around the world so that each child can be as safe, as independent, and as happy as possible. by writing a Turn Autism Around Amazon or podcast review, and by sharing your story with me, you'll be able to help others find out about the Turn Autism Around resources so they can start turning things around too. I can't wait to hear all about your success at marybarbera.com/success. Thanks so much.